The morning sky over Pembrey seemed to deceive the senses. Too blue for war, too calm for the chaos that was to come. It was June 23, 1942, and the RAF base breathed a tense routine of vigilance and silence. Mechanics sipped tea, spotters scanned the horizon, and nothing suggested that, in just a few minutes, they would witness the most unbelievable blunder of the entire Second World War. A dark speck appeared from the east, growing rapidly, slicing through the wind with the shrill sound of a fighter in descent. Eyes turned. That wasn't a Spitfire. The silhouette was different, compact, aggressive, and to everyone's horror, it was a Focke-Wulf FW 190, the pride of the Luftwaffe. But what happened next defied all logic of combat. Instead of attacking, the plane lowered its landing gear and landed. For a few seconds, no one moved. The British were braced for the worst, expecting explosives, a trap, anything. But when the canopy opened, what they saw was a young German officer, pale and confused, removing his helmet and looking around with an expression of pure astonishment. The silence was broken by the crack of a flare. The RAF sergeant, face impassive, kept him covered. The pilot raised his hands. No resistance, no shots. The war's most feared enemy had surrendered, alone. His name, Oberleutnant Armin Faber, a member of the legendary Jagdgeschwader II Richthofen. In that instant, the air war changed. Stay with me until the end and see how a simple navigation error transformed into one of the greatest intelligence victories of the Second World War. How the chance of one man placed in the Allies' hands the key to defeating the machine that dominated the skies. Faber believed he was landing at home, but what he did was open a door that Hitler himself could never have imagined possible, a door that would reveal the best-kept secrets of German aviation. As he was led away by the guards, the British mechanics approached in disbelief, touching the smooth, sturdy fuselage of the enemy fighter. The engine still crackled, exhaling the metallic scent of hot oil. The Nazi eagle insignia gleamed under the Welsh sun. No one spoke. It was as if the enemy itself had knocked on Britain's door and asked for shelter. Faber, dazed, tried to understand what he had done. He believed he was landing at Brest, French territory, after a brutal chase over the English Channel. But the clouds, the sun, and the stress had betrayed him. Instead of turning south, he had headed north and crossed the channel in the wrong direction. Hours later, RAF officers surrounded the fighter with the gazes of those beholding a mythical creature. No enemy aircraft of that model had been captured intact until then. That machine represented terror in the skies. Fast, maneuverable, deadly. Now it stood there, parked in the middle of a British base, untouched. What no one knew was that Faber's landing would not just be a curiosity. It would be the start of a silent revolution in the engineering of war. As the news spread through the bases, Allied commanders wondered, who was this man? How could an elite pilot trained under ruthless discipline commit such an absurd mistake? And above all, what did that plane hide? In the days that followed, Faber would be interrogated. His mind would relive the combat, the fear, the confusion of the clouds, and every second of that flight would become a key piece in a discovery that would change the war's fate.
But before the British engineers disassembled the fighter and revealed its secrets, the world needed to understand how such a human error could be born within a machine designed to be perfect. And that's exactly where our story dives now, into the mind of Armin Faber, the man who believed he was heading home but landed straight in the heart of the enemy. Armin Faber was no rookie. He was a Luftwaffe ace, disciplined, cold, the product of the world's most feared military machine. He had been flying since the war's early years, and that summer of 1942, he piloted the most advanced thing going, the FW-190A3, Hitler's Jewel, capable of outpacing any Allied fighter in speed, maneuverability, and firepower. On the morning of the incident, he took off from a base in northern France on a simple mission, escort bombers attacking the English coast. But the dense clouds over the English Channel hid something no pilot could control: chaos. The dogfight started in seconds. British Spitfires dove from the clouds like hawks, shattering the silence with the sharp chatter of machine guns. Faber reacted instinctively. He dove, rolled, fired. Each maneuver pulled him farther from the formation. The sky was a white and gray whirlpool. The horizon vanished. Without visual reference, the compass wobbled, the sun glinted off the waves, and the brain, under pressure, began to lie. Faber believed he was maneuvering south, toward the safety of France, but in reality, his FW-190 was climbing north, straight toward Wales. Inside the cockpit, the BMW 801 engine roared like a caged beast. Adrenaline surged, and Faber, confident, thought he had shaken the enemy. When the clouds parted, he spotted a green coastline and an isolated runway ahead. Brest, he thought. It was exactly what he expected to see. He throttled back, lowered the landing gear, and felt the gentle kiss of the ground. For a few seconds, he believed he was safe. Only when he saw the blue uniforms rushing toward him and the British flags fluttering did his blood run cold. Too late. A pilot's mind in that instant doesn't think. It just tries to comprehend the impossible. He climbed out of the aircraft, looked at the gray sky, and realized the map in his head had flipped completely. It was spatial disorientation, every aviator's nightmare. In high-speed dogfights, the body loses its sense of gravity, and the brain mixes up north and south, up and down. Faber wasn't the first to be betrayed by the clouds, but he was the only one whose mistake changed the course of the war. In the subsequent interrogations, British officers heard his story with disbelief. A German ace, veteran of dozens of missions, confusing entire countries? It seemed absurd. But the truth would emerge in the technical analyses. The atmospheric conditions that day created a rare optical phenomenon. The sun's reflection on the sea and the angle of the clouds inverted directional perception. It was like flying inside a mirror. And Faber, after diving, believed he had repositioned himself, when in fact he was spiraling in the opposite direction.
While he relived his error, British intelligence began to see something bigger. In that accidental landing, there was more than confusion. There was opportunity. The FW-190 was intact, ready to be studied, a gift that no secret mission could have captured. Faber, unwittingly, had brought to England the Luftwaffe's most powerful air weapon, and with it, the answers the Allies desperately sought. But before the engineers touched the machine, RAF High Command needed to confirm, was it really authentic? Some suspected a trap, a German attempt to infiltrate sabotage technology. And so, in the days that followed, the aircraft was transported under escort to the testing center at Farnborough, the place where the truth would come to light. Faber, now a prisoner, watched in silence through the bars of his cell. His mind replayed the moment the horizon vanished, when sky and sea became one. A mistake, an instant, and a legacy he could never have imagined. But what the British were about to discover inside that German fighter was something that would completely change the way they fought in Europe's skies. And that's where the war stops being just courage and becomes pure engineering. The Farnborough hangar seemed like a temple of human curiosity. Under the watchful eyes of British engineers, the captured fighter rested like a sleeping beast. The Luftwaffe markings still gleamed on the metal, and every rivet told a story of German precision. No one there had ever touched a Focke-Wulf FW-190 until that day. The doors closed, and the sound of tools began. It was like dissecting a wartime secret. The BMW 801 engine with 1,700 horsepower roared in controlled tests, surprising the experts. Reliable, stable, incredibly powerful for an air-cooled motor. Every screw seemed designed by a mind obsessed with efficiency. The initial reports shocked British command. The FW-190's cockpit was a leap in time. Electrically operated controls positioned ergonomically, instruments accessible with a single motion. It was as if pilot and machine were one. The Spitfire, the RAF's pride, seemed archaic by comparison. But it wasn't just the technology that impressed, it was the performance. The German fighter could roll laterally twice as fast as any opponent. The instant roll was the secret that made British pilots lose dogfights in the air. Now that secret lay exposed. If you love diving into real stories that war almost erased from memory, subscribe to the channel now, because every episode here is a journey through the failures and geniuses that shaped the world's fate. In the days that followed, RAF test pilot Eric Winkle Brown was assigned to fly the captured fighter. He was the first Briton to pilot the nightmare of the skies. When he landed, his words were recorded. "This plane doesn't obey the pilot's orders. It obeys his thoughts." Brown immediately understood the danger. The FW-190 wasn't just a fast machine, it was an extension of human instinct. But it also revealed its weaknesses. Above 20,000 feet, the engine lost power, and the controls became heavy. That limitation, unknown until then, would be decisive for what came next. As the notes were compiled, the excitement at the base was palpable. For the first time, the Allies had access to the brain of German engineering. The FW-190 was no longer a myth, it was a living lesson, and every line of its design would be studied, copied, and surpassed. The British realized that to win, it wasn't enough to fly better, they had to think like the enemy. The intelligence captured at Farnborough spread quickly among Allied bases, reaching American engineers. And that's where a silent war began, the War of Minds and Machines.
One man's error had opened the doors to an aerial revolution, and what the United States would do with that knowledge would change the balance of the skies forever. Because in that hangar, surrounded by screws and the smell of burned oil, the beginning of a turnaround was born. The moment when chance turned into strategy. But the real battle was still to come, how to turn Faber's mistake into an advantage that could change the war's fate. The Royal Aircraft Establishment's report reached the hands of American engineers weeks later. It was as if a veil had been torn from Allied aviation. For the first time, they knew exactly how the enemy thought, designed, and fought. The captured FW-190 wasn't just an aircraft, it was a war manual handed over on a platter. The United States studied every detail, from the engine design to the wing curvature. The result was immediate, the development of the P-47 Thunderbolt, and later, the legendary P-51 Mustang, both inspired by lessons drawn directly from the machine Faber had landed by mistake. Technical knowledge turned into strategic advantage, and advantage turned into air dominance. The engineers at Wright Field in Ohio marveled at what they saw. How did they achieve this with so little aluminum, they asked, analyzing the fighter's sturdy yet lightweight structure. The FW-190 was a synthesis of efficiency and brutality, easy to maintain, lethal in combat, and designed to withstand damage that would bring down any other plane. But its weakness, revealed in British tests, would be exploited to the limit, the loss of power at high altitudes. And that's where Allied strategy changed. Now, British and American pilots knew where to strike. Engage above 25,000 feet became the new order. The P-47s, equipped with turbo superchargers, dominated the skies where the FW-190 became heavy and slow. German supremacy, which for months seemed unshakable, began to crumble. Allied victories no longer came just from courage, they came from engineering, data, learning. Every battle was a lesson, every previous defeat a step on the ladder that Faber had helped build with his error. RAF pilot reports show the transformation. Before, flying against an FW-190 was suicide. Now, we knew exactly how it moved, when it retreated, where it failed. Confidence returned to British squadrons. Missions, once filled with fear, began to end in victories. The myth of the invincible fighter had been destroyed, and the symbol of that turnaround was a plane with German insignia stored on English soil. On the other side, when Germany, Luftwaffe High Command received reports of the capture with outrage. Hitler demanded answers. How could an elite pilot commit such an absurdity? He reportedly said, furious. Armin Faber, the man behind the error, became a ghost within his own Air Force. His confusion was studied, his name erased from honor rolls. Germany needed heroes, not reminders that even the best could get lost in the clouds.
But the impact of his mistake continued to echo in the heights. In missions over occupied France, P-47s and P-51s began using maneuvers inspired by the FW-90 studies themselves. Ironically, the tactics created to defeat the Luftwaffe were born from the Luftwaffe. It was as if Faber had, unwittingly, taught his enemies how to fight. Allied reports were clear. Based on analyses of the captured aircraft, we developed new attack and evasion procedures. In other words, Germany's defeat began inside a British hangar. The following months proved the cascading effect. The RAF modernized its Spitfires, launching the Mk IX, a direct response to the FW-90. That model restored air parity and returned control of the English Channel to British pilots. Victory statistics began to balance out, and the Germans lost the dominance that once seemed eternal. All because one man, in a single instant of disorientation, mistook the sea's reflection for his homelands. The irony was brutal. War, built on calculation and precision, had been altered by a human error. Faber could never have foreseen that his landing, seen by many as an act of incompetence, would be remembered as one of the most decisive events in aerial intelligence of the Second World War. In the skies, Allied pilots now had something the Germans had lost: information. They knew how the enemy thought, reacted, breathed. And that, more than any armament, was what changed the conflict's fate. The subsequent battles would show the result of that silent turnaround. The war in the skies stopped being instinct and became science. One man's error had been transformed into strategy by thousands. And from there, Armin Faber's name would come to represent not just a navigation mistake, but the thin line between defeat and victory, between disorientation and discovery. But Faber's fate was far from over. While the Allies celebrated their victories, the German pilot faced a new kind of battle, one internal, fought not in the sky, but within himself. Because in the end, the question that echoed was simple and devastating. How could a man who lived to serve perfection be remembered for the greatest imperfection of all? And that's exactly the answer the final chapter of this story will reveal. In the snowy field of fate, Armin Faber's story reached its conclusion, not in the skies, but inside a cell, in a Canadian POW camp. There, the man who once piloted the Luftwaffe's pride woke every day to the same echo in his mind: the sound of the landing gear touching the wrong ground. The war still raged across the ocean, but for Faber, it had ended in that exact instant when he saw the RAF's blue uniform reflected in the cockpit glass. Meanwhile, the FW-90 captured at Pembry became a living relic. For years, it was disassembled, rebuilt, and tested at Farnborough, serving as a reference for all Allied engineering. Every screw on that aircraft was a silent reminder: chance, too, holds power over war.
During the interrogations, Faber was described as calm, cooperative, and introspective. He never tried to justify what he had done. He simply said, "The clouds deceived me." But the British officers knew there was much more there. The story of a man crushed by a war that turned skies into labyrinths. He wasn't a coward nor a traitor. He was an experienced soldier victimized by what no training could predict: the mind's failure under pressure. And, ironically, that failure would be the key that helped change the course of the conflict. While Faber spent the winter in captivity, his plane crossed the Atlantic in fragments of reports and diagrams. The FW-190 captured at Pembry had become an engineering trophy, meticulously studied by the Royal Aircraft Establishment. Every test revealed a secret: the quick roll system, the armament layout, the electric flap control, the advanced cockpit. Everything that had once been a nightmare for Allied pilots now became a survival manual. The impact was immediate. By the end of 1942, Supermarine introduced the Spitfire Mk IX, a direct response to the German fighter's performance. Its Merlin 61 engine corrected altitude deficiencies, and its redesigned wings could roll with nearly the same agility as the FW-190. For the first time in months, RAF pilots felt they had a fair chance in Europe's skies.
And when the Americans entered the scene, bringing British discoveries with them, the triad that would change everything was born. P-47 Thunderbolt, P-51 Mustang, and Spitfire Mk IX. 3 fighters indirectly shaped by one man's error. Across the Atlantic, Faber himself began to grasp the weight of his failure. He learned from Canadian guards that his plane had been tested, studied, and, quote, copied. When he heard that, he just bowed his head. During long walks in the camp yard, he began jotting thoughts on scraps of paper. One note, preserved after the war, read, "What is lost in an instant can teach more than 1,000 victories." It was the record of a man who had become, against his will, an unwitting teacher of history. After the war ended, Faber was repatriated in 1945. The Germany he found was no longer the country he had sworn to defend. It was a moral wasteland, covered in rubble and silences. The Luftwaffe no longer existed, and the names of his former comrades were etched on tombstones or lost in archives no one opened anymore. For years, he lived discreetly, avoiding any ties to the past. He refused interviews, rejected invitations, and never presented himself as a former elite Richthofen pilot. He died in 1976 at age 61, in silence, the same silence that had marked that landing at Pembry. But the plane he unwittingly delivered survived. The FW-190A3, serial number 313, remained at Farnborough until the war's end. It was restored, displayed in museums, and used in technical demonstrations. Even today, its story is told in military academies as the most emblematic example of how chance can redefine the battlefield. What began as a navigational blunder became a watershed between technological arrogance and strategic intelligence. Faber's legacy isn't in victories, but in consequences. His error forced the Allies to rethink how they fought, to study the enemy, to turn failures into learning. The captured FW-190 taught engineers that future wars would be won not just with weapons, but with understanding. It was there that Allied aviation learned the importance of ergonomic design, quick response, and intuitive control, principles that would influence the jet age decades later. No machine is invincible. No error is too small to change the world. That phrase, engraved on the Farnborough Memorial, sums up the paradox of Armin Faber. He wasn't remembered as a hero or a villain, but as a turning point, a reminder that human perfection is an illusion, and that even error can be a form of progress. And perhaps that's the true lesson of this story. War is made of decisions, but history is made of chances. Faber believed he was heading home. Instead, he gave his enemies the knowledge that would save thousands of lives and hasten the end of the very empire he served. If this story surprised you, leave a like and subscribe, because here every forgotten detail reveals how fate is shaped not by certainties, but by detours. And remember, behind every great victory, there's always an error, and sometimes it's exactly that which changes the course of humanity.